Welcome to part 3 of this Maritime Great Britain production of the life of Admiral Nelson. In March 1801, under the command of Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, Nelson set sail from Great Yarmouth for the Baltic in order to smash the armed neutrality that had been orchestrated by the Russian Tsar. The fleet arrived off the Danish capital Copenhagen at the end of March, and despite attempts at a peaceful resolution, the decision was finally made to send Nelson in whilst Hyde Parker, in overall command, stood by. The battle that followed was politically uncomfortable for the British government. They were in effect attacking a neutral state. The Danes, anticipating an attack, had placed heavily fortified batteries on board floating hulks in a line in front of the city. On the 2nd of April 1801, the battle began, and Nelson with his ships moved down the line of Danish batteries in order to attack and destroy them. What was initially expected to take only a little time proved far harder than Nelson had envisaged. The Danes had fortified their city well, and Nelson later described it as the hardest action he had ever fought. As the events dragged on and more British ships became either heavily damaged or aground, Admiral Sir Hyde Parker sent a signal to retreat. This signal is another moment in Nelson history that is heavily discussed and disputed by some historians. Was it a direct order that Nelson ignored? Or was Hyde Parker sighted away from the immediate action, giving his subordinate a get-out if he felt the action was lost? Legend has it that Nelson, when the signal was reported to him, held his telescope to his blind eye and commented, "I really do not see the signal." What is undisputed is that Nelson fought on despite the order. Having noticed a weakening within the Danish line, Nelson sent a letter under a flag of truce to the Danish Crown Prince. This letter was addressed to the brothers of Englishmen, the Danes. Within the letter, Nelson said that he had directions to spare Denmark when no longer resisting. But if firing continued, Nelson would be obliged to set on fire all of the floating batteries he had taken, without having the power of saving the brave Danes who had defended them. The fighting ceased, and Nelson went ashore. Following discussions with the Crown Prince, a truce was agreed and the battle was over. It would later prove to be a battle that could have been avoided altogether if only 18th century communication had been swifter. The Tsar had been assassinated earlier, and the likelihood is that the armed neutrality would have collapsed on its own. In the summer of 1801, talk of yet another impending French invasion was rife, and the people along with their government were making preparations all along the south coast to repel Napoleon and his army. As the hero of the British people was now back in England, it was deemed appropriate that Nelson should be at the forefront of the country's defences. His next command was to be commander-in-chief of a squadron of ships employed between Orford Ness and Beachy Head to prevent the invasion. Having surveyed the French in various anchorages, Nelson saw the port of Boulogne as their most vulnerable and most desirable to attack. The port and its defences were commanded by Admiral Louis de la Touche-Treville, an experienced French naval officer who knew his trade and the vulnerability of his ships in Boulogne well. He was prepared. On the 4th of August 1801, Nelson ordered a major bombardment, but this resulted in little success. Following the bomb attack, he then ordered a frontal assault on the port to take place on the night of the 15th of August. Despite valiant attempts to complete the mission, it was disastrous, and the British casualties mounted until they eventually withdrew. The impact on Nelson of the defeat at Boulogne was immense. On a personal level, they robbed him of one of his favourite young protégés, Edward Parker. Parker had become very close to Nelson, having served with him as a lieutenant aboard Foudroyant in the Mediterranean and at his side during the recent Baltic campaign. After being injured in the Boulogne attack, Parker sustained a lingering and painful death, during which Nelson took personal charge of his care. After losing his leg in an attempt to save him, Parker wrote to Lady Hamilton, "He is now attending me with the most paternal kindness. I would lose a dozen limbs to serve him." Parker eventually died on the 27th of September 1801 and was buried with full honours in St George's Churchyard in Deal. Nelson attended as the chief mourner and is said to have wept uncontrollably against a tree when his young friend was finally laid to rest. In October 1801, Nelson struck his flag for Admiralty leave, and he arrived at his new home, Merton Place, for the first time. While on leave and during the Peace of Amiens, Nelson divided his time between Merton, London and a holiday tour of Wales, visiting Sir William Hamilton's interests in the country. In anticipation of renewed hostilities, HMS Victory had been floated out of Chatham Dockyard, her birthplace, after undergoing a major refit, and was appointed as Nelson's flagship for his new role as Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean. In December 1804, unknown to Nelson, the French Admiral Pierre de Villeneuve, the man who had eluded him at the Nile, was given orders to break out of Toulon with his fleet and commence a ruse to draw the British Navy away from the English Channel. In March 1805, after an earlier aborted attempt to put to sea, Admiral Villeneuve was once again ordered to depart from Toulon and to head for the Caribbean.